This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. Panama has been the unlikely target of President Trump's attention since he returned to the White House. On today's podcast, we'll look at the Panama Canal's past, present, and future in an attempt to understand where this crisis is headed next.
I think the Panamanian political opinion is right on target that we just ran into China's arms. And the big promise that China will invest billions of dollars in Panama never materialized. I do think that the big China time in Panama is over.
As Donald Trump returned to the White House, I think we all understood that Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, and Cuba would be in the spotlight. But if you guessed that Panama would be making headlines and the site of Marco Rubio's first trip abroad as Secretary of State, well, congratulations, you were more of a visionary than I was. After the initial shock passed, I recently spent several days in Panama trying to figure out exactly what President Trump may want there. Does he really want the canal back, as he said in his inaugural speech on January 20th? Or would he be content with a reduced Chinese presence in the ports on either end of the canal, greater Panamanian cooperation on migration, and reduced fees for some U.S. ships passing through the canal? Now, it's impossible to know for sure. President Trump wants it that way. But when you spend time on the ground in Panama, there are a few things you begin to understand better. The first is that China's presence really has expanded a lot in Panama over the past 10 years or so. They're not controlling the canal, of course, contrary to what the president says, but they are involved in several key infrastructure projects, which might indeed give them a chance to disrupt canal traffic in the event of a broader conflict with the United States. The second thing you see is just how linked Panama is to the U.S., more so, perhaps, than any other country in Latin America. Everybody knows the country exists in part because of the U.S., but the ties that were established over the course of 80-plus years of U.S. control of the canal remain very strong today, a kind of symbiotic, some say perhaps almost colonial, relationship that probably helps explain why President Trump might think he could take the canal back. I thought it would be interesting to talk about Panama's past, present, and future, to understand how we got here, to figure out if maybe the uncertainty has now passed following Secretary Rubio's visit, or if Panama will continue to be an object of President Trump's attention, and therefore uncertainty to Latin America and the rest of the world in the months ahead. Our guest is Rodrigo Noriega. He's a Panamanian political analyst, someone who knows all this history well, understands the current day as well. Rodrigo, welcome to the AQ Podcast.
Thank you. It's a real honor for me to be part of this podcast.
Rodrigo, how have the Panamanian people processed all of these events since President Trump first registered his complaints about the canal in December? This was such a big surprise to us in the U.S. Tell us about how people have reacted within Panama.
The public opinion here in Panama, I would say, was very confused and is very concerned about these comments. First of all, because we had no notice, no early warning that they were coming this way. And second, because the United States is our most important political and economic ally. And if they have this major issue about Chinese penetration, alleged penetration of the Panama Canal, we needed to understand what were they looking at. And right now, up to my best understanding, there is no new information, no data that disproves what we already know.
This leads to my next question, which is the question so many of us have been asking since December, which is, what do you think this is really about? I mean, in your mind, what does President Trump want? Do you think he is serious about trying to retake the canal? Is he mostly focused on the Chinese presence near the canal?
I would say all of the above and other things. First of all, Donald Trump knows Panama. He had been visiting Panama since 2003. He was the owner of the Miss Universe contest, and we held Miss Universe in 2003. And he invested massively in a significant hotel here in Panama. He lost the hotel to J.W. Marriott hotel chain in about 2017, 2018 in a lawsuit. And it was very embarrassing for him to see in the primetime news how they took away his name from this hotel in Panama. And in addition to that, in his, let's say, in his closer inner circle, Donald Trump has some people who may have conflicts of interest with Panamanian investments. So that just adds a little bit of spice to the whole conflict.
All right, well, let's take this one by one. I mean, let's start with President Trump's personal history in Panama, because this is an issue that I think people know less about. You seem to be implying that this may be personal for him.
Oh, yeah. This is personal. He knows Panama. At the time, was the most important investment in real estate in Panama, this Tom Ocean Club Hotel, which is in the central part and the best district of Panama City, and was, I think, $300 or $400 million investment. This is a 70-story tall hotel and penthouse apartments. I mean, it's gorgeous. And that was a symbol of Panama and also was a symbol of Trump, expanding into Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, he lost that because he only put his brand name and some seed capital, and the rest was investors' money. And apparently there were some commitments about some bonds and some loans that he didn't fulfill on time, and the main investors took over the whole business.
Tell us a little bit about the United States relationship with Panama over the years, specifically during those 80-plus years when Washington had control of the canal itself, because I'm not sure our audience knows all of that history. I'm not sure any country in the region has had quite as much U.S. influence as Panama.
Yeah, the United States probably have the most radical influence in Panama. It helped create the country. The next year will be 200 years when the first United States delegation came to Panama for a Congress called by Simón Bolívar in Panama. And it was basically to launch the new era of inter-American relations. Remember, this was during the days that James Monroe had issued the famous Monroe Doctrine, America for Americans, which at the time was considered very progressive by people like Bolívar, for example, who thought at those days that, this is good. This means America, the continent, will be for American nations, not for European colonies. Then in the 1850s, the United States built the first interoceanic railroad here in Panama, a 50-mile railroad. The French gave the United States the Statue of Liberty as a token to build the Panama Canal. So Lady Liberty in New York is a token in order to tell the Americans, hey, we are your friends, we admire you guys, we don't want to compete with you guys, we are not your enemies, so let us build the canal. And in 1882, Ferdinand de Lesseps, who was the person who built the Suez Canal, he was a diplomat, not an engineer, started the project in Panama. It was a big failure. There was a lot of corruption, a lot of mismanagement. Then in 1903, the United States, who had backed Colombia, every time there was a revolution in Panama, Panama attempted 17 times to declare independence from Colombia during the 19th century, and most of those times, the United States backed Colombia. Then in 1903, the U.S. switched sides and decided, okay, we're going to bet on Panama. Maybe we can get a treaty, and maybe we can get a much better relationship done with Colombia. And Panama declared its independence November the 3rd. And on November 18th, the French guy who had the managing authority for the French Canal, was in bankruptcy, signed a treaty with Secretary of State John Hay. That's the treaty that originated the canal.
And then, Rodrigo, as we get into the 20th century, it's really true that the United States influenced, let's say, Panamanian political culture and culture at large, including the country's economic development.
Yeah, Panama was under, I would call it an arrested development paradigm. For example, in the first decades of the Republic, British investors wanted to build a railroad from Panama to all the way to Costa Rica on the west. And the United States refused to allow this project to go on. That was outside the canal zone. There were American investors. I know one case, one anecdote told to me by my father. My father did a master's degree at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor during the 40s, and he met former Ford executives that had come to Panama to look for land to make a factory. And the U.S. government told them, no, you're not building any factory here in Panama. With your strange labor ideas and so on and so forth. You're going to distract the economy from our focus. Goodbye, go away. That will have been the first Ford factory outside the United States. Just imagine the industrial tradition that Panama would have had 100 years later. We don't have an industrial tradition. Panama didn't have radio stations until the 1940s. Why? Because the United States banned, prohibited, controlled Panamanian radio waves. So the pain, we call it the pain, the weight of having this relationship with the United States was very hard on Panama, was very expensive for Panamanian development.
Rodrigo, it's funny, we don't always go this deep into history on our podcast, but I just think it's so important to understanding, again, this unique role that Panama has played in the history of the United States and vice versa. This idea that you find in a lot of circles and strategic circles, military circles, that the canal is uniquely important to the United States, that it plays such a key geopolitical role because of, you've got 40% of U.S. shipping container traffic that goes through the canal, 5% of global trade overall. And, some people believe that because of that importance, it gives Washington the ability to impose conditions upon Panama. I think you see echoes of that in President Trump's mentality now.
Let me explain one thing. About 14,000 ships cross the Panama Canal every year. 80 to 84 of those ships are U.S. Navy ships. They pay about less than $2 million a year. The Pentagon spends more on coffee or on toilet paper than what they spend on crossing the Panama Canal. It's not an issue at all. The U.S. Navy has the priority of any ships. If there are 100 ships online and a U.S. Navy ship comes by, it goes first. And it gets the super VIP treatment. And so it's a non-issue. Every ship, every vessel that is moving in the waters of the Panama Canal is run by a Panama Canal captain. It's not even run by its own captain. So there is no way a Chinese captain can block the canal. Why? Because every ship is controlled by the Panama Canal.
We'll be back right after this short break. The Peruvian-American writer Maria Rana wrote a fantastic book about the history of people of Latin American descent in the United States. The book is called Latino Land. We'll be hosting Marie here at the Americas Society in New York City on February 26th to talk about the Latin American diaspora, past and present. The event will be free of charge and followed by a reception. You can register on our website, that's americasquarterly.org. We hope to see you there. So let's talk about China, because this is so central to this discussion. President Trump has said that the Chinese control the Panama Canal. That is not true. He has said that there are Chinese troops inside the canal. That's also not true. But what is true is that China does control the ports at either end of the canal through the Hong Kong-based company CK Hutchison. Since President Trump was elected, the Panamanian government has announced that it will review the concession contract for Hutchison for control of those two ports. It kind of seems to me like maybe the Panamanian government is likely to find a pretext for Hutchison's concession to be cut short. Do you agree? And do you think that would be enough to satisfy President Trump and put an end to this crisis?
First of all, the audit ongoing right now is not because of U.S. interest in getting Hutchinson out of Panama. It's because the Panamanian public opinion have been pressuring the new authorities to get more info about the let's say the renovation of the lease of Hutchinson. Hutchinson lease was over in 2022, but the previous government just basically extended it by 25 more years. The same conditions. You have a new canal and you get the same old conditions agreed on 1997. Just imagine we got Hutchinson out of Panama. Just imagine that case. Would that be enough to please President Trump, or will he insist on other things? My concern is that there are other issues that he may be interested in. He may want to have somebody sitting from the United States government in the board of directors of the Panama Canal, or he may want to put a U.S. citizen to manage the Panama Canal or something like that to just have a victory lap saying, oh, we got back the canal. That's my concern. My second concern is that Panama may give away, like the mention of a possible military base in Darien, something that may violate the neutrality pact, which is the main defense of Panama, is that neutrality agreement that was signed with the canal transfer agreement. If we, Panamanians, violate this neutrality pact by giving the United States a military base, nobody else, the UK, Russia, France, Denmark, Mexico, Israel, whomever signed the treaty, is going to raise a hand to help Panama.
Rodrigo, on the subject of China, their presence of Panama is not just limited to these ports. We saw over the last 8 years or so a really important expansion of ties between Beijing and Panama. We saw Panama enter the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, also known as the Silk Road Initiative. President Molino now said after Secretary Rubio's visit, he's going to cut that short. But we also saw Panamanian cities acquire, quote unquote, safe city technologies. That's a patented Chinese technology that includes surveillance. We saw a visit by Chinese Premier Xi Jinping. I mean, in retrospect, is there any view in Panama that perhaps those ties went too far?
Yes, I think the Panamanian public opinion is right on target that we just ran into China's arms. And the big promise that China will invest billions of dollars in Panama never materialized. I do think that the big China time in Panama is over. China itself lowered its presence, lowered its commitment to Panama. They had weekly 3 flights from Air China. After the pandemic, they never came back. There was a big promise of sending thousands and thousands of Chinese tourists to Panama. That never materialized. And on other issues, also, just promises. I mean, so they are focused on political high-profile projects and on the Belt and Road Initiative, Silk Road Initiative, which in the case of Panama, basically Mr. Molino said, Panama is not renewing the MOU on the Silk Road Initiative.
What do you think happened? I mean, what do you think China really wanted from Panama? Was it more economic? Was it more geopolitical? The fact that these investments did not come through, what's your interpretation there? What happened in your mind?
I would say there are several issues. Panama has very open access to big financial markets in New York, London, and so on and so forth. Okay, so we don't need China as a backup. Number 2, Panama is a dollarized economy. And most Panamanians realize we don't want to raise the dollar. We have the greenback circulating in Panama since 1903, basically. And we don't want to risk that. That has given the country a lot of financial stability, a lot of inflation control, a lot of international reputation, and we don't want to risk that. And in addition to that, my gut feeling is that China realized that the Panamanian economy, in a way, is a very closely knit economy. In order to start a major investment in Panama, you need to build long-term relations. And the Chinese didn't have enough time to do that.
I suppose all this gets at the heart of my next question, which is how and why is Panama so vulnerable to these threats from President Trump, from the United States? It's partly because of the fact that Panama is a dollar-based economy. You can imagine that if there were severe financial restrictions, like the ones that President Trump announced and then quickly withdrew against Colombia after that recent dispute there, something like that would be devastating for Panama.
Yeah. Panama is not a major exporter to the United States. There are major vulnerabilities the Panamanian government has. For example, last January 7th, Panama established a regulation to allow the Ministry of Economics and Finance to register at the Securities and Exchange Commission of the United States to issue $10 billion in bonds, in foreign debt for Panama. Okay, just imagine if the Securities and Exchange Commission or the Treasury Department say, oh, Panama, by the way, you cannot register any more bonds here in the States. That will be a catastrophe for the financial center of Panama, and it would be a disaster for the national economy.
How would you describe the Molino administration's approach to this situation? I mean, we saw in the meeting with Secretary of State Rubio a seeming willingness to consider almost everything short of handing the canal back to the United States. How would you describe the government's tactics?
President Molino is a former Minister of Foreign Relations, so he knows the job. He was Minister of Foreign Relations for about 4.5 years, so he knows the job. He has a very good relationship with traditional United States sources of power. I mean, the Pentagon, Southern Command, the State Department, and so on and so forth. But those tracks are not what works right now. You need to have access to Donald Trump inner circle. You need to have more access to the Senate, especially the Foreign Relations Committee, because those are the guys and the gals who may stop or who may water down some of Donald Trump's intentions. And at the same time, you need to get in contact with countries such as Canada, Mexico, Denmark, that may become your natural allies in having a coalition, a multinational, multilateral coalition to water down U.S. rage.
Talk to me a little bit, Rodrigo, about another issue that the Trump administration has raised, which is migration. President Molino made stopping or slowing migration through the Darien Gap a centerpiece of his campaign in 2024. Even before Donald Trump was elected in the United States, he was taking this issue really seriously. But I understand that there are also some red lines probably for the Molino government on this issue.
Right. On July 1st, 2024, first day of the Molino government, he signed an MOU with the United States Department of State to fund the trips, the repatriation, deportation trips by air from Panama. There are about, I guess, 50 or more trips, mostly Colombians, Ecuadorians, Peruvians, some people from Asia, from China, from India, and some people from Africa. Those trips have been sponsored by the United States, okay? The Molino government basically closed down Darien. There were 7 roads, 7 paths to cross the Darien Gap. The Molino government closed 6 of them to force migrants and smugglers to move migrants to only one path. That had reduced the migrant flow amazingly by 94%. 94% before Donald Trump even took office.
I heard some concern when I was in Panama that the Trump administration might ask Panama to take immigrants from third countries, such as, for example, Venezuela. And I understand that because of what happened in the 1990s with Cuban migrants who were sheltered in Panama, that might be a red line. That might be something that Panamanian society might not accept.
You're right. In 1994, during the Clinton administration, we housed about 10,000 Cubans who were going to the United States, and the United States wanted to slow the Cuban migrant flow, and they held them in a U.S. military base that they used to have here. It was a very, I would say, very eclectic show, because every day we had a story about a Cuban migrant falling in love with a Panamanian woman, or a Cuban migrant writing a new song, or something like that. Cuba and Panama, they have very similar cultures, the way we speak Spanish, the way we play salsa, the way we cook, quite similar. So there was a lot of understanding. But nonetheless, it was very cumbersome to have this situation. And those Cuban migrants were going to the U.S. Now you have maybe 300,000 Venezuelan migrants which are deported, expelled from the U.S. Where are you going to hold them? How long are you going to keep them in Panama? Because we don't have any diplomatic relations with Venezuela. So are you going to keep them in Darien? Wow, there are no schools there, there are no hospitals there, there are no nothing there. There's just a highway and the jungle. So, I mean, the potential for havoc, for disaster is very high. And most likely, the Panamanian public opinion will reject this offer, this situation after some time.
So, Rodrigo, what's your best guess as to where this goes now? I mean, it did seem during Secretary Rubio's visit like we saw a path toward a resolution of all this, that if Panama goes along with, reducing China's presence near and around the canal and some other steps, that we might see President Trump back off his threat to try to take back the canal for the United States. Do you see this as a crisis on its way toward being resolved?
They had two meetings. The one that came with the agreement about migrants, the one that came with the notion that Panama will jump from the Silk Road Initiative and so on and so forth. And then Mr. Trump made a comment last night, on Sunday night, that totally changed the humor, the spirit of the whole meeting. Just basically saying that, nothing happened for his purposes. Nothing happened. That the United States may do something powerful to get the canal back, whatever that means.
So you think you think there's still a lot of road in front of us when it comes to this confrontation between Panama and the United States?
I would say there is a major improvement because now we Panamanians, we know what is the game about, okay? It seems to be about China, mostly. If we can get 60%, 70% of the issue away by solving the ports issue, then maybe we can, through the Senate, through multilateral pressure, we can get the other 30% or 40% out of this and just find some middle point agreement somewhere down the road. My best hope is that other international issues, the tariffs on Mexico, Canada, China, whatever, or some other conflict may take away the time and the concentration that Mr. Trump has on Panama right now.
Rodrigo, thanks so much for joining us on the AQ Podcast.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.